morning on Cathera IV was soft and golden. The sky was pale blue with thin clouds that moved slowly across it like they had nowhere important to be. Air smelled like grass and wet soil. Birds, small, bright ones that had been brought from Earth 3 generations ago, sang in the trees along the colony's outer paths. It was by any measure a perfect morning. Vass was on her knees in her garden when the sun came up. She was 79 years old, with white hair cut short and a face that had seen too many suns on too many worlds. Her left arm was a prosthetic, old titanium alloy, scratched and dull from decades of use. She had been offered a newer model 6 times. She had said no 6 times. The old arm knew her. The new ones didn't. She pressed seed into the dark soil one by one, slowly, carefully. Her knees ocked. They always ocked in the morning. She didn't mind. Aching knees meant she was still alive, and had spent enough years in places where staying alive was not guaranteed. Behind her, the colony of Elegum shores stretched out in a wide, gentle arc. It was a beautiful place. Low white buildings with wide windows, paths of flat stone winding between gardens and common areas, a large central hall where people gathered for meals and music, and the occasional loud argument about card games. Solar panels on every roof, a sky that turned purple at sunset. Elegum Shores was a retirement colony. It had been built 40 years ago by the Human Colonial Authority, specifically for veterans and long-service workers who had given most of their lives to the expansion and defense of human space. People came here to rest, to grow things, to sit on porches and remember, or to sit on porches and try to forget. There were just over 3,000 residents. Their average age was 78. Some used canes, some used powered mobility frames that carried their weight when their legs could no longer do it alone. Some were missing parts, arms, legs, eyes, replaced by machines that worked well enough. All of them had earned their place here. None of them were considered dangerous by anyone in the galaxy. That was the first mistake anyone had ever made about Elegum Shores. Harlan M. Webb was already awake when was planting her seeds. He was 84, tall and thin, with large hands that had been cutting and stitching and saving lives since he was 22 years old. He had been a combat surgeon for 30 years, deployed to 8 different conflict zones across 4 star systems. He had operated on humans, and twice on aliens, and once on a dog that a captain refused to leave behind. He had saved more lives than he could remember and lost some he would never forget. Now he made tea every morning in a small kitchen and looked out his window at the colony paths, and he was happy, not the loud kind of happy, the quiet kind which lasts longer. He was reading a medical journal when his neighbor knocked on the door. An old woman named Suki, who was convinced something was wrong with her ankle. He put down his tea, got up slowly, and went to help her, because that was what he did. Yuta Kazin was at the edge of the colony when the sun rose, moving through a slow exercise routine in the open field. She was 77, short and lean, with gray hair tied back and dark eyes that still moved the way they had always moved, taking in everything, missing nothing. She had spent 30 years in special operations, working in small teams in places that didn't officially exist, doing things that weren't officially done. She had been very good at her job. She didn't talk about it. People who had been very good at that kind of job usually didn't. She finished Her routine stretched her back and walked back toward the colony at a steady pace. She noticed the birds had gone quiet for a moment. They came back. She noted it and kept walking. Petra Soliv was underground. She was almost always underground. She was 81 years old, broad-shouldered with grease-stained hands and eyebrows that seemed permanently set in an expression of mild suspicion toward anyone who didn't understand engineering. She had designed the drive systems for 3 human warships during her career at the Colonial Engineering Corps. She had also spent 20 years overseeing planetary infrastructure, tunnels, foundations, power grids, the things that kept colonies alive when everything else went wrong. When she retired to Elysium Shores, she had done what she always did. She had looked at what existed, decided it wasn't good enough, and started improving it quietly, persistently, without asking permission. Because in her experience, asking permission just slowed things down. Underground levels of Elysium Shores, which were originally designed as simple storage and utility spaces, had been transformed over 12 years into something considerably more serious. Reinforced walls, redundant power systems, air recyclers that could run for months without surface input, tunnels that connected every building in the colony to the central hub without going above ground. She had told the Colony Council it was earthquake preparation. It wasn't only that. Cormeg was fishing. He was 88 years old, the oldest resident of Elysium Shores, and he had once commanded a fleet of 11 warships in the Battle of Reach Corridor, a 3-day engagement that had broken a hostile advance and saved 4 human colonies from occupation. He had been decorated more times than he could be bothered to count. He had given speeches to governments, armies, and graduating classes of young officers who looked at him like he was something from a story. He was, in his private opinion, just a tired old man who wanted to fish. The lake at the southern edge of the colony was cold and clear and full of large, slow fish that were not particularly hard to catch. Dress sat in a small chair at the water's edge every morning, with a line in the water and a thermos of coffee and nothing else, and he was the most content he had been in 40 years. He caught 2 fish that morning. Before the signal came, it came from Petra's satellite. Most people in the colony had forgotten the satellite existed. Petra had not. She had maintained it quietly, patched its aging sensors twice, and refused every suggestion to decommission it. The colony didn't need a military early warning satellite. People said this was a retirement colony. They said there was nothing out here to worry about. Petra had smiled and kept the satellite running at 3:00 in the morning colony time. The satellite saw what was coming. Far out in the dark, past the edge of Cathara IV's small system, 12 ships had dropped out of faster-than-light travel. They were arranged in a formation that was not commercial. It was not exploratory. It was a combat formation, used when you intended to go somewhere and take it. The ships were Voy. The Voy Dominion was a mid-sized power in the galactic community. They were not the largest or the strongest, but they were ambitious, and over the past 20 years they had been quietly expanding their territory through a combination of diplomacy, pressure, and when those failed, force. They had an eye on Cathara IV's mineral deposits for some time. The moon held large reserves of a rare element used in advanced drive systems. It was worth a great deal of Money, it was also currently occupied by 3,000 old humans who, according to every intelligence assessment the VOI had run, posed no meaningful threat. The VOI intelligence report on Elysium shores had been thorough. No military installations, no active weapons systems, no warships in the area. Average biological age of residents 78. Physical condition declining, estimated. Combat effectiveness negligible. Estimated time to subdue and occupy less than 90 minutes. The Valky Council had approved the operation unanimously. What the intelligence report had not included, because the analysts who wrote it had no framework for understanding it, was a list of what those 3,000 people had done before they retired. The alarm Petra had built into the satellite system was not loud. It was a single clear tone that went directly to 6 personal communicators, the ones belonging to the 6 people she had quietly identified years ago as the people who would need to know first if something like this ever happened. Ara was still in her garden when her communicator buzzed. She looked at it. The screen showed a simple readout: 12. Contacts, formation type, heading. Estimated arrival time, 4 hours. She read it twice, then she stood up slowly. Brushing the soil from her knees, she looked at her hands, one flesh, one metal, and then she looked up at the sky, which was still soft and golden and peaceful because the ships were still far away and the sky didn't know yet. She thought about the seed she had just planted. She thought about how long they would take to grow. She thought about the fact that in 4 hours something intended to make sure they never grew was going to arrive. Then she picked up her communicator and made the first call. Harlan answered on the second ring, still in his kitchen, still holding his tea. She told him what was coming. He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "I'll get the medical bay ready." He didn't ask questions. He had spent 30 years in places where questions waited until the situation was understood. Yuta answered immediately, as though she had been waiting. Ara told her the numbers. Yuta asked one question. Timeline. Ara told her. Yuta said understood and hung up. Ara could hear in the background the sound of Yuta already moving. Petra already knew she had written the alarm herself. D took longer to answer. When he did, there was a fish splashing in the background. R told him what was coming. There was a pause. How many ships? He asked. 12, she said. Another pause. The sound of a fish being put back in the water. I'll be there in 10 minutes, he said. He did not sound happy about it. He sounded like a man who had been interrupted at something he was enjoying, by something he had been half expecting for years. Put her communicator away. She looked at the sky one more time. The birds were singing. The air was still warm. The colony was still quiet around her. 3,000 people sleeping or waking slowly in the way of people who have no reason to hurry. She hadn't been in a real fight in over 20 years. She had thought, genuinely thought, that she was done with all of that. She had earned this garden. She had earned these mornings. She had earned the aching knees and the slow breakfasts and the long, quiet evenings. The VOI had not asked her permission before deciding to take it from her. She picked up her old prosthetic arm, which had been resting in her lap during the planting, and clicked it back into place at her shoulder with a sound like a lock closing. She hadn't been angry in a long time. It felt familiar, like putting on an old uniform. She walked back toward the colony. There was a great deal to do before the ships Arrived in 4 hours was not very much time, but it was enough. It was enough. If you didn't waste it, behind her the seed she had planted sat in the dark soil waiting for light. She intended to make sure they got it. The central hall of Elysium Shores was built to hold 500 people for meals and gatherings. It had round tables, comfortable chairs, stage at the far end where someone played guitar on Friday evenings, and large windows that looked out over the colony paths and the gardens beyond. By 4 in the morning, all 3,000 residents were inside it. They came in slowly at first in ones and twos, woken by the colony-wide alert that Petra had triggered from the underground control room. Some came in robes, some were already dressed, some came on canes, some in powered mobility frames, some moving carefully on legs that had been replaced by mechanical ones that worked better than the originals but still took a moment to warm up in the cold morning air. A few were in wheelchairs. Nobody complained, nobody panicked. They came in, found seats, and waited. That was the first thing that might have surprised an outsider. Had one been present, the waiting was calm. 3,000 people who had just been woken before dawn by an emergency alarm, who had just been told that enemy warships were coming, and the hall was quiet. There was murmuring, yes, a few conversations in low voices, but no screaming, no crying, no one running in circles. These were not people who frightened easily. Most of them had been frightened before, really frightened in situations where it was entirely appropriate to be frightened, and they had learned long ago that fear was only useful for a few seconds. After that, it just got in the way. Stood at the front of the hall and looked out at the faces, looking back at old faces, tired faces, faces with scars and lines, and the particular steadiness that comes from having seen things and survived them. She told them the truth. 12 Voy warships combat formation, estimated arrival in just under 4 hours, likely objective the colony's mineral assets, likely method orbital bombardment followed by ground occupation. The Voy believed the colony would surrender quickly or be destroyed quickly, and in their understanding of the situation, both outcomes were acceptable. She paused when she finished, let it sit. Then a voice from the back of the hall, old and dry and completely unhurried, said, "Well, that was rude of them." A ripple of quiet laughter moved through the room. It broke something. The shoulders that had been tight came down a little. The faces that had been hard softened just slightly, and then one by one, and then all at once people began to talk, not in panic, in the tone of people getting to work. Raised a hand, and they quieted again. She told them the plan. It was simple, because simple plans survived contact with reality better than complicated ones. The surface was to be evacuated, everything and everyone below ground, into Petra's tunnels and reinforced spaces. The Voy would bomb the surface. Let them. The surface was buildings and paths and gardens. It could be rebuilt. The people could not. Once the landing force touched down, and it would touch down because they would think the colony was empty and broken. The second part would begin. She didn't call it a counterattack. She called it a welcome. There was another ripple of laughter, smaller and darker this time, the kind that knew exactly what it meant. The mobilization that followed was something that would later be described by a galactic assembly observer watching the recording as the most organized thing he had ever seen that wasn't a professional military operation, and then he corrected himself because it was a professional military operation. It just happened to be run by people whose average age was close to 80. Roles were not assigned, they were claimed. People walked up to the coordination tables. Team had set up and said what they could do, and what they could do was almost always exactly what was needed because 3,000 veterans and specialists covered an enormous range of skills and experience. Harlan M. Webb had the medical bay running. In 18 minutes, it wasn't fast in the way that a young person moves fast, all urgency and speed. It was fast in the way that someone who has set up a field hospital in a muddy trench in the middle of a firefight moves. No wasted steps, no unnecessary motions, everything in the right place the first time. He directed 8 other former medical personnel with brief, clear words. They moved around each other without getting in the way people move when they have worked together in difficult places. He found himself humming as he worked. He hadn't noticed until one of the nurses pointed it out. He stopped, thought about it, and started again. It helped him focus. It always had. Udak went underground and did not come back up for 30 minutes. When she came back, she had a full inventory in her head. Not written down, just remembered. Because she had always been better at remembering than at writing things down. She found a Lara at the coordination table and gave her the list. Mining rigs, 14 large industrial type, capable of cutting through rock at significant speed. Atmospheric processors, 3, which could be modified. Survey drones, 42 most functional, a few needing minor repairs. Construction mechs, 8 heavy duty, used for building work but built to handle serious stress. Commercial grade tunnel explosives, enough to cause significant problems for anyone who came underground without being invited. She also mentioned, almost as an afterthought, that 2 of the colony's residents, a pair of former demolition specialists who now spent most of their time playing chess, had immediately, without being asked, begun sorting through the explosives and organizing them by type and size, with the focused happiness of people who had found a use for a skill they thought they'd never need again. Ara nodded at each item. She had known most of it was there. Petra had made sure of that. Petra herself was already deep in the underground engineering bay, surrounded by schematics she had been quietly updating for years. She had pulled 3 of her most technically skilled helpers, a former shipbuilder, a former weapons systems engineer, and a woman who had once designed the power grid for an entire space station, and they were working in near silence, speaking in the shorthand of people who understood each other completely and had no time for anything else. The mining drills could be repositioned, not quickly but quickly enough. The drill heads were originally designed to break rock, but rock and armor were not so different if the force was concentrated correctly. The atmospheric processors, with some changes to their output systems, could become something else entirely. The survey drones could carry more than cameras. Petra worked with the focus of someone who had been waiting a long time to solve a specific problem. She had hoped, genuinely hoped, that this problem would never need solving, but she had prepared for it anyway, the way a careful person always prepares for the thing they hope never comes. Above them, the first voy ships entered the system. The orbital bombardment began 40 minutes before the Landing force was scheduled to arrive. The Voy commander had ordered a targeted strike on what his sensors showed as the colony's main structures, the central hall, the residential buildings, the power relay stations, standard doctrine. Soften the target before landing. The colony shook, dust fell from tunnel ceilings, a few lights flickered in the underground hub. People braced against walls and tables and each other and waited. The surface took damage, real damage. Buildings cracked and fell. The beautiful stone paths buckled and broke. The gardens Alara had tended for 6 years were buried under debris and ash. The solar panels were gone. The central hall, which hours ago had held 3,000 voices, collapsed into rubble, but the ground beneath held. Petra's walls held. Her foundations held. Her tunnels held. The air kept moving through the recyclers. The lights came back after the flicker. 3,000 people sat in the reinforced dark below a ruined surface. And they were whole. Dress watched the bombardment data scroll across a screen. In the communications room, which Petra had quietly built into the deepest part of the underground network over 7 years, he had a coffee in one hand and a stylus in the other, and he was drawing something on a data pad. It looked at first glance like a rough diagram of the local space around Cathara IV, with the Voe fleet positions marked as small circles and the colony's position marked. At the center, he was calculating not with formal tools or advanced software, just with his own head and 40 years of fleet experience and a memory that had never fully stopped thinking in tactical terms, even during the years of fishing and quiet mornings. The Voy fleet was arranged well, he thought, for dealing with another fleet, for dealing with a colony of retired old people. It was perhaps more than was needed, which told him their commander was cautious. Cautious was better than reckless, but cautious commanders sometimes hesitated. At unexpected developments, he made a note of that. The landing ships came down 20 minutes after the bombardment ended. 4,000 Vi soldiers in armored carriers descending through the smoke and dust of what had been a peaceful colony, expecting to find rubble and frightened survivors. They found rubble. They did not find survivors. The surface was empty. The rubble was empty. Every path, every broken building, every shattered garden empty. The Vakai soldiers moved through it in formation, weapons ready, scanning for movement, finding none. The lieutenant in command of the 1st Ground Unit sent a message back to the fleet. The colony appeared abandoned, no visible population, no signs of organized resistance. The bombardment had likely caused a full evacuation, or the population had fled before the attack. He moved his unit deeper into the colony grounds. In the tunnel network below, Ara watched the sensor feeds. Yuta stood beside her, reading the movement patterns of the Voe soldiers on the surface with the particular stillness of a person who has spent a great deal of their life watching enemies move without being seen. They're coming in fast, Yuta said quietly, confident. Good, said. The soldiers moved between the ruins, checking structures, reporting empty. They were efficient. They were well trained. They were not expecting anything, because everything they had been told them there was nothing here to expect. Watch them walk deeper into the kill zone. She had been in this position before, not here, not on this moon, but in this exact moment, the moment before. The thing begins when everything is still and quiet, and only you know how Completely, the situation is about to change. She had been 26 the first time. She felt it. She was 79 now. It felt exactly the same. She looked at Yuta. Yuta nodded. She looked at Petra, who was watching a different screen with her arms folded and the satisfied expression of someone whose work was about to be tested. She looked at Drez, who was still writing on his data pad and had not looked up, but whose foot was tapping very slightly, the only sign in 50 years of knowing him that he was paying close attention. She looked out at the tunnel corridor where the first strike team was waiting in the dark. Former soldiers, former operatives, former people of very specific and very dangerous skills, all of them old, all of them quiet, all of them ready. 3,000 retired humans waited in the dark, and the moon itself seemed to hold its breath. Then Allura said, "Now," and the welcome began. The first thing the Vi soldiers heard was not an explosion. It was a hiss, a low, grinding hiss, like the sound of something enormous moving through rock. The soldiers in the 3rd unit, moving through the eastern ruins of the colony, stopped and looked at the ground beneath their feet. Their sensors showed nothing. The ground looked solid, broken in places from the bombardment, cracked and dusty, but solid. It was not solid. Petra had spent 12 years thinking about this exact moment. She had looked at the colony's surface layout, and she had looked at the VAI standard approach formations, and she had made some very careful decisions about where to position the mining drill heads, and the answer had turned out to be right there. The ground burst open 4 places at once. The drill heads, which were each about the size of a large vehicle, punched upward through the surface with a force that had been redirected from their original forward cutting motion into a straight vertical strike. They came up fast and hard, and the VOE soldiers standing above them went in every direction. 3 armored personnel carriers were struck directly. 2 flipped and rolled across the broken ground. 1 was simply crushed and thrown to the side like it weighed nothing. In the space of 6 seconds, the eastern formation lost 1/3 of its strength and all of its composure. The second thing that happened was that the ground opened sideways along the colony's main central path, or what had been the path before the bombardment had turned it into a ridge of broken stone. 8 hatches that had been perfectly concealed under debris slid open from below. Yuta's teams came up through them at a pace that was not fast. It was measured, deliberate, unhurried, the way you move when you are not rushing because you don't need to rush, when you already know exactly what you are going to do. They moved in pairs, covering each other with the automatic coordination of people who had done this before, many times in worse conditions. They hit the Valky units from the flank and rear, where the soldiers were still turning in confusion from the drill eruptions, and they were precise in a way that young soldiers rarely managed to be. They did not waste shots. They did not take chances. They didn't need to take. They did not freeze. They did not hesitate. A Vi sergeant tried to rally his unit. He had trained for ambushes. He knew the protocol. He started shouting orders, and his soldiers began to respond, turning toward the threat. And then the ambush shifted. The pair split, drew fire from different angles, and the sergeant found himself trying to track 5 directions of threat at once with soldiers who were already shaken. He was good at his job. The problem was that the people on the other side of the fight were better at it and had been better at it for longer. Then he had been alive. Yuta herself did not go above ground. She moved through the tunnel network at a pace that looked casual to anyone watching, but covered ground quickly. She was reading the sensor feeds on a small device strapped to her forearm, tracking the void positions above, adjusting her teams with short-coded signals, 3 words, sometimes 2. Her people understood. They had been briefed well, and more importantly, they were the kind of people who only needed to be briefed once. She passed a junction where 2 of the former demolition specialists, the chess players whose names were Bowen and Fitch, were crouched over a wired connection. With the focused attention of surgeons, they had rigged a series of charges along a tunnel that ran directly beneath the Valkai's primary landing site. They were not going to detonate them yet. They were waiting for a specific position. They were patient. They had always been patient. It was in their shared opinion the most important quality in their former line of work, and also in chess. Bowen looked up when Yuta passed. He raised 2 fingers. 2 minutes. She nodded and kept moving. In the medical bay, Harlan M. Webb was already working. The first casualties from the ambush were brought down within 20 minutes of the fighting starting. They were colonists from one of the strike teams, an older man with a shoulder wound and a woman whose mobility frame had taken a hit and needed emergency bypassing before she could move again. Harlan looked at the shoulder wound, made a rapid assessment, and began working. The woman with the frame was taken by his technical assistant, who had once worked as a combat medic and now applied that knowledge without drama or pause. More came in, not many. Yuta's teams were taking far fewer hits than they were giving, because experience plus preparation is a very effective form of protection, but some it was a real fight, not a demonstration. People were getting hurt. Harren worked steadily. He talked while he worked, not out of nervousness, but because he had found over 40 years that people healed better when there was a calm voice in the room. He talked about small things: weather before the bombardment, the fish in the lake, a story about a surgery he had done in a field hospital on Century Station so many years ago that the patient was probably a grandparent now. A young colonist, young meaning 53, one of the few non-retire support workers on the moon, was brought in shaking, not from a wound but from shock. She had been in the outer corridors when a tunnel section near her had vibrated badly from a surface explosion. She hadn't been hit, she was just frightened. Harren stopped what he was doing and looked at her directly. He gave her a specific task: hold this, watch that monitor, tell me if the number changes. Something real, something she could do. She focused on it. She stopped shaking. He had learned long ago that giving a frightened person something to do was more effective than telling them to calm down. Calm down was not a task. Hold this was a task. He kept working. Meanwhile, on the surface, the VOE landing commander was dealing with a situation that did not match anything in his briefing. He had 4,000 soldiers on the ground. He had expected to walk through a destroyed colony, collect any survivors, establish control of the mineral access sites, and send a clean success report to the fleet within 90 minutes. He was now 40 minutes in. Third of his eastern formation was out of action. His central units were being harassed by flanking attacks that appeared and disappeared before they could be engaged properly, and his Communication lines were producing a constant stream of reports that all said variations of the same thing. We can't find them, they're behind us, they came from the ground. He had been told the residents were old, he had seen the medical reports, he had believed them. And it was true that the fighters engaging his forces were old. When he managed to get visual on any of them, he could see it clearly, but what his intelligence had measured as a weakness was not behaving like a weakness. His soldiers were trained, fit, young, and equipped. They were losing ground too. People who moved more slowly than them, hit more accurately than them, and seemed completely unimpressed by anything they tried. He sent a message to the fleet contact, more significant than expected, requesting additional assessment. The fleet admiral received this message and read it with a frown. He sent back a simple reply: continue. The operation expected resistance is minimal. The commander read this reply and looked at his casualty board. Then he went back to trying to manage a situation that kept getting worse. Petra's next move was the atmospheric processors. They had been running for months at their normal purpose, keeping the underground air clean and the temperature stable. Over the past 4 hours, Petra and her team had modified 3 of them. The changes were not complicated if you understood the systems involved, which Petra did in a way that very few people in any part of the galaxy could match. She had spent years designing systems far more complex. This was for her a small adjustment. The processors were now pushing a heavy chemical mist upward through the colony's ventilation outlets that came out at ground level across the entire surface. The mist was not toxic. Petra had been careful about that. It was a dense, low-visibility fog that smelled strongly of iron and settled close to the ground, cutting visibility on the surface to roughly 4 meters in any direction. The VOE soldiers, already confused and taking fire from multiple directions, were now moving blind. Yuda's teams, who knew every tunnel exit and every surface feature by memory, were not blind at all. High in the fleet, watching the situation from the comfort of the command ship, the Vula Admiral was receiving his 6th update. In an hour, each one incrementally worse than the last. His landing force was engaged. His casualties were climbing at a rate that should have been impossible against a retirement colony, and now his sensors were showing reduced visibility across the entire surface. He was starting to wonder if his intelligence department had made an error. He pulled the original report and read it again. Retirement colony, no military assets. Average age 78, estimated combat effectiveness negligible. He looked at the casualty figures again. He looked at the report. He looked at the casualty figures. For the first time, the VOE Admiral felt something he was not accustomed to feeling in an operation of this type. It was a small, cold feeling that settled in the back of his mind and asked a question he didn't have a good answer to. What exactly the feeling asked is down there, back underground. Ara moved through the main hub, checking positions, getting updates, adjusting the picture in her head. She had a small command unit working with her, 6 people who had all held significant command roles in their careers and who now coordinated information the way a musician plays a familiar piece smoothly without thinking about each note. A report came in from the Northern Tunnel Network, a VAI unit had found one of the ventilation access hatches and was attempting to breach it. Ara listened. The hatch was reinforced. It would hold. She redirected a two-person team to cover the corridor beyond it just in case, then moved on. Valky Captain came close to her position. During the surface fighting, he was trying to flank around what his sensors told him was the source of the attacks. On his unit's left side, he moved, carefully checking corners, doing everything right by his training. He came around the edge of a collapsed building and found the position empty. The team had moved 3 minutes before he arrived, repositioned to a point he hadn't considered. He hadn't considered it because it wasn't obvious. It required knowing not just where to move, but where someone would come from after being displaced, which required understanding how your enemy thought and anticipated, and he had not expected to need that kind of thinking against this particular enemy. Ara had moved her team there because she had seen the same situation 30 times in 30 years, and she knew exactly what came next. She wasn't faster than the Voy Captain, she wasn't stronger, she just already knew how the story ended. Message came through to the landing commander's communicator. It was addressed to him directly through his personal command channel, which should have been secure. It was from no identified source. It said in clear text, "You were told this colony was undefended. Whoever told you that was not well informed. You have 2 choices. You can continue, and we will continue, or you can recall your soldiers. The second choice costs you less." The commander stared at the message, then he looked at his casualty board, then he picked up his communicator and sent a message to the fleet. It said, "These are not civilians. Request immediate reinforcements." The admiral read it. He looked at his screens. He looked at the casualty numbers, which had now passed a figure that no operation against a retirement colony should ever approach. His expression changed. The comfortable, confident look of a commander managing routine operation was replaced by something older and colder and more careful. On paper, the retirees of Elysium Shores were the least dangerous humans in the galaxy. The Vakai were learning painfully that paper meant nothing. He began to consider options he had not prepared for, and down below in the tunnels and the ruins, 3,000 people who had spent their lives preparing for exactly this, even when they had hoped they would never need to, kept working. They did not rush, they did not tire. They simply kept going in the steady, unstoppable way of people who have nowhere to retreat to and nothing to prove, and every reason in the world to hold their ground. The moon was still turning. The sky above the ruins was still dark, and in the deep rock below, old soldiers who had been told by the universe that their fighting days were over were quietly, thoroughly, and without any particular drama, proving the universe wrong. The order came down from the Vakai fleet at 6:00 in the morning colony time. The admiral had made his decision. The ground operation was not proceeding as planned. His landing commander was asking for reinforcements that the admiral was not ready to send until he understood what he was dealing with, and while he tried to understand it, his casualty count kept climbing. His soldiers on the surface kept losing ground to an enemy that had no right to be this effective, and the situation kept getting worse in a slow and steady way that he found more disturbing than a sudden sharp crisis would have been. So he had made the calculation that commanders in his position sometimes make when the ground operation fails. He would remove the surface, a second bombardment, heavier, this time more complete. He would not leave a stone on top of another stone. Whatever was keeping his soldiers from winning, he would remove it from above. Then he would land again properly, this time with more soldiers and a surface that had been reduced to powder. He sent the strike order to his bombardment crews and gave them 30 minutes to prepare. The sensor system in the colony's deep communications room saw it. Immediately, the shift in the fleet's formation, the powered-up energy signatures from the three largest warships as they moved into position. Dress was the one watching the screen. He had been watching it for hours, tracking the fleet movements with the patience of a man who had spent a great deal of his career watching the space between ships and understanding what it meant when those spaces changed. He saw the formation shift and he understood it the same way he understood most things, not from a manual but from memory. He picked up his communicator and called Ara. They're setting up for a second bombardment, he said, heavier than the first, 30 minutes, maybe less. This one isn't aimed at the surface. They're going for depth. They want to crack the underground. Took one breath, then she said, how sure are you? Completely, he said. The tone he used when he was completely sure. She called a war council in the main hub. The same people who had met at the beginning of all this, Dress, Yuta, Petra, Harlan, gathered around the central table while the sounds of the ground fight continued above them. Everyone looked tired, not the tired of people giving up, the tired of people who have been working hard and are not done yet. She told them what Drez had seen. She told them what a second bombardment of this type would mean. Even Petra's reinforced underground structures had limits. A sustained deep strike bombardment from 3 heavy warships could, given enough time, crack the foundations they were standing in. The people here were protected from the kind of attack that had come before. They were not protected from this. Nobody in the room panicked. There was a short silence, the kind of silence where people think rather than speak, and then Petra set her coffee down on the table and said, I've been waiting for this part. Everyone looked at her. She pulled up a schematic on the central screen. It showed the colony's industrial layout, the processing facilities, the ore handling systems, the heavy machinery used for extracting and launching the mineral canisters that were Cathara IV's main export. She walked them through what she had been thinking about for 12 years, quietly, alone in the engineering bay late at night. Cathara IVs, or launchers, they were industrial rail guns, 8 of them positioned at 4 points around the colony's surface perimeter. They were designed to take dense canisters of raw mineral ore, each one massing about 2 tons, and accelerate them upward into low orbit where automated freighters caught them and carried them to processing stations elsewhere in the system. It was an efficient and well-established method of getting heavy materials off a moon's surface without the cost of conventional launch vehicles. It also, Petra explained with the careful calm of someone stating a mathematical fact, meant that they had 8 large, powerful electromagnetic launch systems already installed in the colony's surface infrastructure. They were not precise targeting weapons. They were not designed to hit moving objects. But they were large, they were powerful. And with the modifications she had already quietly made to 2 of them over The past 6 hours, adjustments to their targeting capability, changes to their loading cycle, and a new trajectory calculation system she had written herself 3 years ago and kept on a data chip in her pocket. They could be used to launch things into low orbit on trajectories that would intersect with objects in that orbit, objects like warships. There was a silence around the table. Dress looked at the schematic. He looked at the performance numbers. He looked at the trajectory tables Petra had pre-calculated. He picked up his stylus and his data pad and began working through the numbers with the focus speed of someone whose mind had never really stopped doing this kind of calculation. How accurate? He asked. Not very, Petra said. Think of it like throwing a very large rock at a very large target from a very long distance. We won't hit what we aim at precisely, but the targets are ships, not points, and a 2-ton ore canister moving at that velocity doesn't need to be precise. Dress nodded once. Give me the fleet positions, I'll calculate solutions. Petra gave him the data. He bent over his pad and started working. Nobody interrupted him. Everyone in that room had learned long ago that Cormac Dress, when he was calculating, was to be left entirely alone. Yuta looked at the ground forces. She said, I know. Said, we use the drones. Colony had 42 survey drones plus 12 mining shuttles that had been adapted over the years for various surface tasks. None of them were weapons platforms. None of them were militarira. They were small, slow, and fragile. They were in large numbers, moving on multiple trajectories simultaneously. Was exactly what Drez had called in his early assessment a distraction machine. The Voy Fleet Point Defense Systems, the automated weapons designed to shoot down incoming threats, were capable. They were well programmed and fast, but they had a rate of fire limit and a tracking limit and a simultaneous target limit. If enough things were coming at the fleet from enough different angles at the same time, some things would get through. Yuta began organizing the drone launch sequence. She did it with the same quiet precision she brought to everything. The drones would go first in waves, drawing the point defense systems into continuous fire. Then the ore canisters would come up behind the drone, waves on trajectories that had been calculated by a man who had done this kind of math at a level nobody in the Vi fleet would expect from a fishing pole in a retirement colony. Dress looked up from his data pad. Ready, he said. He had targeting solutions for 6 of the fleet, 12 ships, the 3 bombardment vessels, and 3 of the escort warships. 2 solutions he rated as high confidence, 4 as moderate. He was honest about the limitations because honesty about limitations had always been the difference between good admirals and dead admirals. 2-tone canisters, he said quietly, mostly to himself. I really did not expect to be doing this today. He almost smiled. Are the launchers ready? Asked Petra. 2 fully modified, 3 more at partial, the rest are standard. They'll fire, but we can't steer them. Well, good enough, Ella said. Begin the drone sequence. Launch in 5 minutes. The drone launch was something to see, though no one above ground was in a position to fully appreciate it. 42 survey drones and 12 mining shuttles went up from concealed launch points across the colony surface, spreading wide as they climbed, separating into groups that approached the fleet from 7 different vectors. They were broadcasting every kind of electronic Signal they could produce active. Sensors, power missions, communication. Bursts making themselves look like as many different things as possible. The HFY fleet point defense systems engaged. Immediately, the drones began dying. They were not designed to survive. They were designed to be numerous and busy. They did their job well, and then the launchers fired. The sound was enormous, even underground. 8 rapid, heavy concussive pulses that went up through the rock and the damaged surface, and into the air, and then into space. The ore canisters, solid, dense 2 tons each of raw mineral weight, climbed out of HFY's gravity well on the trajectories Dres had calculated, and the fleet barely saw them coming because its point defense systems were still tracking and firing at the drone swarm. The first canister missed its target entirely. It passed between 2 ships and kept going, disappearing into deep space. The second one struck the main hull of a HFY bombardment cruiser dead amidships. There was no explosion. It was not a missile. It was a rock moving very fast. The effect was significant. The hull cracked along 3 structural frames. The ship's drive system went dark. It began to drift. The third and fourth canisters fired in rapid sequence at the second bombardment ship, both connected, one to the forward weapons array, one to the engine section. Ship held together, but it was no longer a weapons platform. It was a very expensive piece of damaged metal trying to maintain its position in orbit. The 5th canister was a moderate confidence solution. It caught the edge of an escort warship, struck its communications array, and stripped it clean. The ship veered away and out of formation. The 6th missed the 7th from one of the partially modified launchers, struck the 3rd bombardment cruiser directly on the port bow. The impact did not destroy the ship, but it tore open the forward section and vented 3 compartments to space. The cruiser immediately began an emergency withdrawal from its orbital position. By the time the HFY fleet fully understood what had just hit it, 3 of its 12 ships were damaged, 2 of them seriously. The planned second bombardment was no longer happening. The ships that were supposed to carry it out were no longer capable of doing so, or were busy surviving. Dres watched the damage reports come in. On his screen, his expression was still. He made 3 small marks on his data pad, the old habit of an admiral, updating his tactical picture. 3. Confirmed, 2 probable, he said. Better than I expected from unguided or canisters. He paused. We should note that I just damaged a HFY fleet with a system designed to move rocks. I'd like that on record somewhere. Nobody wrote it down, but everyone in the room remembered it. On the surface, the ground battle changed the moment the fleet was struck. The HFY soldiers, already under pressure, got the news through their communicators that their fleet was under attack, that the ships overhead, the ships they had been told were completely safe and completely in control, were taking damage from the thing below them. The thing they had been told was a retirement colony. The effect on morale was significant. The effect on the landing commander was decisive. He had been holding his forces together through discipline and training, and the reasonable belief that this situation, however bad it had gotten, was still manageable because the fleet was there and the fleet was safe. Now, the fleet was not safe. His communicator was full of confused traffic from ships that were trying to understand what had just happened. He had no reinforcements coming. He had no second bombardment to rely on. He had soldiers on the ground who were tired and confused and being pressured on every side by fighters who were not tired and not confused and who knew every piece of ground they were fighting on. He made the decision quickly because quick decisions in a deteriorating situation are better than slow ones. He ordered his forces to pull back to the landing zone and hold position. Ara heard about the withdrawal through her sensor network. She allowed herself a single moment of stillness, standing in the tunnel corridor with her eyes closed, and she said nothing, and she felt the particular feeling of a situation going the way it was supposed to go. Then she opened her eyes and started working on the next part. Because it was not over, the fleet still had 9 functional ships. The landing force was still on the surface. The HFY would regroup and they would decide what to do next, and what they decided would determine how this ended. But the tide had turned. The entire galaxy would know about it soon, because Dress, with the particular wisdom of an old admiral who had learned to use every tool available, had made sure that the communications array had been broadcasting on open frequencies for the last 40 minutes. Everything, the ground fight, the bombardment, the ore launchers, the damage to the fleet was on record. The neutral systems in the region had heard it. The galactic assembly relay stations had heard it. The void had come to Cathara IV to take something they had left behind, their dead, their wounded, their pride, and a lesson the rest of the galaxy would spend decades repeating to its children. The bill had come due, and it was much larger than anyone in the Vi Dominion had expected to pay. The sun was rising over Cathara IV. Above the ruins of the surface, the sky that had been dark and full of enemy ships was beginning to clear. 3 of those ships were drifting. 1 was leaking drive plasma in a bright trail that could be seen from the ground below in the tunnels. 3,000 retirees kept working, kept watching, and kept holding. They had always been good at holding. The Vi landing force surrendered at midday. It did not happen all at once. It happened in pieces, the way large things that have been held together by pressure and habit fall apart when the pressure stops. First 1 unit, then 2 more, then the rest. The landing commander sent the formal signal at 12:07 colony time. His remaining soldiers laid down their weapons on the broken surface of Elegum shores and waited. Ujida's teams came up from the tunnels and collected the weapons and organized the prisoners with the kind of efficiency that made the Vi soldiers very quiet and very cooperative, not because the people collecting their weapons were threatening, but because those people, who were old and slow-moving and in some cases leaning on support frames or walking with a slight mechanical stiffness, had just beaten them thoroughly on their own ground, and that was the kind of thing that made a soldier very careful about causing any further trouble. The Vi fleet above Cathara IV began its withdrawal. 2 hours later, the 3 damaged ships had to be helped, 2 of them towed by their undamaged companions, moving slowly away from the moon and back toward the jump point that would take them home. The whole fleet moved quietly in the manner of something that wanted to leave. Without being noticed, they were noticed. The communications array that Dress had been running on open broadcast had been doing its job for hours. Every signal, every report, every piece of Data from the battle had been going out on frequencies that the Galactic Assembly's relay network picked up and carried across the settled galaxy. By the time the Void fleet crossed the outer boundary of the Cathara system, the story had already reached dozens of worlds. A retirement colony had been attacked. The retirement colony had fought back. The retirement colony had won. The first outside ships arrived at Cathara IV 3 days later. They were news vessels, small, fast, crewed by journalists who had received the broadcasts and come as quickly as they could. They were followed by an official Galactic Assembly inspection team, then by a diplomatic vessel from the neutral collective of Amber Worlds, then by 2 human colonial authority ships that had been dispatched the moment the broadcasts reached their command. They all expected to find something dramatic. A colony in ruins, yes, but filled with the particular energy of a place where something historic had just happened. They expected people who looked like they had just been through a war, tense, exhausted, marked by it. What they found was a colony that was largely back to its normal routine. The surface was still broken, and that work would take months to repair properly, but underground everything was running. Meals were being served, people were in the common areas reading or playing games or sitting in the corridors, talking quietly the way they always talked. The medical bay had cleared most of its patients. The tunnels were busy with the organized movement of people who had tasks to do and were getting on with them. Harlan M. Webb was the first person the journalists found because he was the first person they were allowed to see, a rule Ilara had established on the reasonable grounds that she was not letting a crowd of news people loose in the colony until someone had spoken to them properly. Harren was chosen because he was a doctor, and a doctor's presence tended to calm people down. He met them in a small room near the main tunnel entrance, still in his working clothes, with a cup of tea that had gone cold. He answered their questions patiently and at length because he genuinely enjoyed talking to people and found their questions interesting. They asked him what it was like to defend a colony against an invading force at the age of 84. He thought about it carefully. Honestly, he said, my hip gave me more trouble than they did. It seizes up when I stand for too long. I had to sit down twice during the operations. The Voe never sat down once. He paused. I still outlasted them. They asked him if he was afraid. He considered this too. There were moments, he said. There are always moments, but I've been doing difficult things in difficult places for 60 years. When you have that much experience, the fear gets smaller. It doesn't go away, but it gets smaller, and there was too much to do to spend time on it. The journalists wrote everything down. They wrote it down very carefully because they had the instinct of their profession that something important was being said, even if it was being said quietly and without drama. Yuta Kazin did not meet with the journalists. She was back on her schedule, morning exercises in the main tunnel corridor, which was longer than the field and worked well enough. She was aware that people wanted to speak with her. She was not interested. When an assembly officer tracked her down, young man who was clearly very impressed by what she had done and equally clearly not sure how to express this, she looked at him steadily while he described her unit's tunnel operations as unprecedented. That's how we did it in '89, she said in The Balara campaign, same technique. We didn't have as many tunnels then, but the principle was identical. Nothing new. The officer blinked. You've done this before. Similar, she said. Not exactly the same. Every situation is different. She paused, but people don't change as much as they think. Soldiers at the back of a column behave the same whether they're Voe or human or anything else. Once you understand the pattern, you understand the response. She finished her exercises and walked back to her quarters. The young officer stood in the corridor and wrote a long note to himself about what she had said. Petrov was doing what Petrov always did, working. She had a full damage assessment running and a reconstruction schedule plotted out that she estimated would take 8 months. She had submitted a 14-page proposal to the Human Colonial Authority within 24 hours of the Voya withdrawal, recommending that all outer reach human colonies with mineral extraction operations review their industrial equipment for potential dual-use capability in the event of an attack. She included detailed technical specifications. She also included a note at the end that her modifications to the ore launchers were available for sharing and that she had already improved the targeting system and could improve it further if given 6 more weeks and a reasonable supply of components. She was not a military person. She was an engineer, but she understood in the way that engineers understand things that good design is useful in more context than you originally intend. That was not a flaw, that was good design. She was also in the spaces between planning and working quietly. Glad the launchers had worked as well as they had, not because of the damage to the fleet, though that had been necessary, but because it meant 12 years of thinking about a problem she had hoped was hypothetical had not been wasted. She found somewhat to her own surprise that she cared about that deeply. Cormac Dres had already been fishing by the time the first news ships arrived. The lake had been untouched by the bombardment. The Voe had not considered a lake a strategic target, which told you something about the limits of their intelligence work. And his chair and his thermos and his rod were all exactly where he had left them. He refused every interview. He refused every request for a statement. He refused a formal commendation from the Galactic Assembly Security Committee via communicator with a politeness that made it very clear the refusal was final. He refused somewhat more firmly a parade proposed by the Colonial Authority. He did accept without comment a small package delivered by an automated drone 3 days after the battle. Inside was a new fishing rod, top quality equipment, clearly expensive, with a short note that read from the crew of the CNS Harrier. We heard outstanding work, Admiral. He read the note once, put it in his pocket, rigged the new rod, and spent the rest of the morning fishing. He caught 3. The Galactic Assembly moved quickly by that body's standards. The Valky Dominion was formally cited for unprovoked aggression against a civilian colony within 2 weeks. 3 of their outer territories were placed under Assembly oversight. Their military expansion program was frozen for 20 years. 2 senior Valky officials were required to appear before an Assembly tribunal. The Valky tried through their diplomatic representatives to describe the attack as a misunderstanding, a navigation error, a communication failure, an intelligence failure of a kind that could happen to anyone. They used a lot of words The words did not help, partly because the evidence was overwhelming and partly because they broadcast recordings from Dres's communications array showed everything in clear detail and had already been seen by most of the settled galaxy. The story of Elysium Shores was told on a great many worlds in the weeks that followed. It was told in different ways, by different people. Some focused on the tactics, the engineering, the skill involved. Some focused on the particular irony of an attacking force being defeated by the people it least expected to face. Some told it as a funny story, the kind that gets better each time it's passed around. Some told it very seriously as a story about what happens when you underestimate a person because of how old they are. All of them got part of it right. The Galactic Assembly Security Committee requested a private meeting with Ara 2 weeks after the battle. They were a serious group of people from a number of different species and governments, and they sat around a large table in a room that smelled of old documents and careful decisions. They asked her polite questions about the colony's defense and her response to the attack. Then near the end of the meeting, one of them, a senior delegate who had been listening more than speaking, leaned forward and asked the question that had clearly been on the mind of everyone in the room since the beginning. "Commander Voss," he said, "how many human retirement colonies exist in the outer reaches?" Ara looked at him steadily. She had known the question was coming. She had thought about how to answer it. She had decided to answer it with the truth, because the truth was more effective than anything she could have invented. "Hundreds," she said. The room was very quiet. "And are they all?" The delegate paused, searching for the right word. "Similar to Elysium Shores." Ara thought about what she knew of those other colonies, the people in them, the careers they had lived before they retired, the habits that don't leave a person just because their work contract ends, the knowledge that doesn't disappear just because it's no longer officially needed. "Each one is different," she said, "but the people in them are people who spent their lives doing difficult work in difficult places. That doesn't go away when you stop drawing a salary." The delegate sat with that for a long moment. Then he wrote something in the small notebook he had been keeping beside him throughout the meeting. The meeting ended. The committee dispersed. Several of them in the weeks that followed would find reasons to quietly revisit their assessments of outer-reach human settlements. Ara went back to Cathara IV. The surface reconstruction had begun. Heavy equipment was clearing debris. New foundations were being laid. It would be a long time before Elysium Shores looked the way it had on the morning of the attack, but it would look that way again. Petra had put it simply. "Buildings fall down, we put them back up. That's always been true." Ara found a cleared section of her garden. Most of it was under rubble or had been burned by the orbital strikes. But one corner, the corner she had been working on that morning before the alarm, had somehow survived. The debris had fallen around it. The soil was dark and untouched. She knelt down slowly, her knees aching the way they always ached, and she put her fingers into the earth. The seeds she had planted were still there, small, intact, waiting. She sat back and looked up at the sky, which was pale blue and crossed with thin white clouds that had nowhere important to be. The Vakai ships were gone. The smoke from the bombardment had cleared days ago. The birds were back. She could hear them in the surviving trees at the colonies. Edge, the same small, bright birds that had been here since long before this. Trouble started. A young woman sat down. Beside her, Myra, the 53-year-old colonist that Harlan had studied in the medical bay during the worst of the fighting. She had taken on a coordination role in the reconstruction and was doing it well. She sat quietly for a moment, looking at the garden, and then she asked the question she had been trying to find the right time to ask for days. Were you afraid? She said. During the battle, were you afraid? Ara looked at the soil. She thought about the question seriously, the way a serious question deserves to be considered. No, she said, I was angry. There's a difference. Fear makes you freeze. Anger, the right kind, makes you remember exactly who you are. Myra was quiet for a moment. What's the right kind? She asked. The kind that's not about hate, said the kind that comes from something worth protecting. She touched the soil, this garden, these people, the right to grow old in peace, without someone deciding your peace is theirs to take. She looked up at the sky. Again, pale blue, calm, the kind of morning that she had come here to have. On a moon she had come here to rest on. In a life she had earned the right to live quietly. She had retired from war. War, it turned out, had not retired from her, and on the day it came knocking, it found that some things, like certain old soldiers and certain old instincts, do not diminish with age. They simply wait. And when they are needed, they wake up. Steady, clear, and entirely ready. She pressed her hands into the soil and began to work. Above her the sky stayed clean and open, and the birds kept singing, and Elysium shores, battered and broken on the surface and completely unbroken underneath, kept going as it had always intended to.